Hello everyone and welcome to YouTube channel War and Politics. We continue to review the important news related to Ukraine and the Russian invasion. My name is Sofia Trushchuk and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest. It's Andreas Umland, a German political scientist. Andreas, hello and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the US is withdrawing troops from Europe and Chinese soldiers have been found in Ukraine. These are the main topics of our conversation. I suggest starting with this. The United States is withdrawing troops from Jasenka Airport in Poland. The Polish defense minister assured that other allies remain to work in this hub of assistance to Ukraine. In your opinion, how can this fact change the situation in Eastern Europe?
This is indeed a sad development. America has been in Europe, heavily present in Europe for 80 years. And it's also a policy and a position that the United States has chosen by itself. Today, it's often said that Americans often say that Europeans have not fulfilled their obligations within NATO. And that is certainly true. We have not spent enough money on defense. We have not built strong enough armies. But on the other hand, it's also true that the United States has itself chosen this role in Europe to be a protector of Europe. This is now changing, and we Europeans have now to adapt to this rapidly and as soon as possible because the stakes are really high.
The European Union is stepping up its defense efforts, but NATO still relies on the participation of the United States, said Secretary General Mark Rutte. How much can Europe rely on the US for defense now?
That's a good question. Would be perhaps somebody to ask, better to ask somebody in Washington about it. I'm currently in Kiev, and the support of the US is, I think, at least for a transitional period, crucial, because we have basically built our security system assuming that the US would play at least some role in it. And if it now comes down to the US fully withdrawing from Europe and perhaps refocusing on the Indo-Pacific sphere, then we will be left with gaps in our defense system. And one can only hope that the current signals that we are getting from Washington are overdrawn, are not what the soon reality will be, that they will not become material reality, and that the US, in spite of the strange rhetoric that is now coming out from Washington, that the US will remain a member of NATO and will also be committed to the defense of Europe.
And the Pentagon considering proposal to cut thousands of troops from Europe. Officials say experts warn that the timing of the potential drawdown could alarm NATO allies and embolden Russian President Volodymyr Putin. Can such US actions really inspire the Russian dictator?
Yes, one fears that this could be something that is seen as a sign of weakness on the part of the West. And we know from the past that such impressions of weakness are then escalatory. And that is often something also misunderstood, especially in Western Europe, less so, I think, in Central Eastern Europe, where people basically know how Russian imperialism works. So in Germany, in my home country, for instance, there are many people who believe if we show weakness, military weakness, this will be sort of good for peace, whereas in fact the opposite is true, that signs of weakness then lead to escalation. And it was the wrong impression that Russia had of Ukraine, that Ukraine is weak. And that's why the large invasion started in 2022. That's why we have now this war. That was a miscalculation by Russia. And I think also that Europe is strong without the US, but we could again have a miscalculation on Moscow's side, and we could then even have an escalation, let's say in Estonia, at the city of Narva, where Russia would think that it can sort of revise the results of the downfall of the Soviet Union, at least partly, and then count on European weakness. And that may be a miscalculation, as it was with Ukraine. But then once you are in a war, then it's very, very difficult, as we now see with the Russian-Ukrainian war, it's very difficult to get out of it. So this impression of weakness that the American behavior now is giving is very dangerous.
I want to continue this topic. International press and military analysts are increasingly writing about the danger of Russia's attack on European countries. In your opinion, is Europe ready for such a tide of events, and which countries are, for today, most ready?
I guess the countries that are most ready are also the most in danger. These are Finland, the Baltic countries, Poland. These are the countries that also have the most immediate concerns about the security of their borders. And the problem are largely the West European countries, also some East European countries like Hungary. But the West European countries are problematic because they still live in this old world, the pre-2014, I would say, world in which basically there was some sort of established order that more or less functioned. With 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, I think this European order fell down. But many, for instance, in my home country, in Germany, do not want to see that. They think if they only believe that this is not true, then it will not be true, and they are still talking about pacifism and about not investing in defense and security. So the large countries still need a sort of a transitional period. That's why I'm saying it will be very important that the US is not so quickly leaving Europe. If it's in stages, if it's sort of drawn over several years, then countries like Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and so on, they can adapt to the new situation, but they cannot as quickly change as it now looks necessary.
Ukrainian officials will visit the US at the end of this week for talks on a deal governing post-war plans to exploit mineral deposits and rebuild infrastructure. What is your opinion about the second round of these meetings? Can it end well for Ukraine?
I'm not sure, because this is a very strange development. We had at first an apparently unacceptable proposal from the US to Zelensky, which he flatly rejected. That was a scenery when the finance minister of the US went to Kiev and had then a very difficult conversation. Then we had actually, in a second stage, an acceptable proposal, an acceptable draft for a deal between the US and Ukraine about the joint exploitation of Ukrainian rare earth and other minerals and so on. And then a third draft appeared, which looks almost neocolonial, because it's designed that the US will actually take over large parts of the Ukrainian economy and of its natural resources. So this draft was then again very strange, and I hope that now the negotiations will perhaps return to the second draft, which Zelensky was already ready to sign, but then there was this scene in the White House, and then the whole deal did not work out. So hopefully this time it will work out, and there will be a deal that is acceptable to Ukraine, and then perhaps indeed this could be a reset then also for Ukrainian-American relations.
We really hope. We really hope. And about something interesting and a little bit crazy, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the Ukrainian Defense Forces captured 2 Chinese citizens who fought on the side of Russia. There is also information that there are more than two such soldiers. Does this somehow change China's role in the Russian-Ukrainian war?
If these were indeed serving Chinese soldiers and not just, let's say, volunteers, Chinese volunteers who have joined the Russian army, then this would be a major development. If indeed these are actually serving soldiers, officers, whatever, of the Chinese army, that would change the nature of the war, and it would be also a violation of the various agreements between China and Ukraine. So, for instance, many people don't know that, but there's a friendship treaty between China and Ukraine, a fully ratified friendship treaty signed under Yanukovych, but then ratified by China when Poroshenko was already president of Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea and after the war started in 2014. So there is this friendship treaty, and there's a large article in this friendship treaty which is about the mutual recognition of territorial integrity, inviolability of borders, national sovereignty. And if it turns out that these Chinese persons are serving army members of the Chinese, of the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, then this would be a major development. But maybe they are just volunteers. I mean, then on both sides of the front line, there are many sort of outside volunteers who have come to either to Ukraine or to Russia to fight. So if these are just private persons, then this would be less of an issue.
I want to discuss some interesting news from The Hill. The media writes that some of the US politicians discussed the Nixon to China policy in recent weeks. In this scenario, the US would make concessions in Ukraine and thereby pull Russia out of China's orbit. Do you believe in such a scenario? And does the United States really need Russia in this regard?
Yes, this is usually among experts called the reverse Kissinger. So when in the 1970s there was a rapprochement between the United States and China, that was a sort of a trick used by Kissinger to contain the Soviet Union. And that happened in the early 1970s at a time when the relations between the Soviet Union and China were tense. And then there was this sort of half alliance between China and the US, and was then at that time regarded as a big success for US foreign policy to get basically China into a sort of front against the Soviet Union. And now the idea is apparently in Washington that you could do a similar trick, only the reverse. That's why it's called reverse Kissinger. That the US could drag out Russia from the Russian-Chinese alliance and then have Russia as an ally against in the confrontation between the US and China, which I think is a ridiculous idea. There was also just an article by Michael McFaul in Foreign Affairs which describes why exactly this is a ridiculous idea. I mean, one of the big differences to the 1970s is when in the 1970s, the US was able to do that with China, China and the Soviet Union were in very tense relations. They were not allies. Currently, Russia and China are de facto allies. And the idea that you can somehow break Russia away from this alliance is ridiculous, because Russia is reliant, is dependent, I would even say, on China. And therefore, this whole idea of sacrificing Ukraine for a Russian-American alliance against China will not work out. The Russian-American alliance has become, the Russian-Chinese alliance has become too close for that to work out.
Chinese officials always comment Russian-Ukrainian war, as they call it, Ukrainian crisis, by the way. In your opinion, does China now have real influence over Russia that could end the war?
I think China has a lot of influence on Russia. And as I said, Russia is partly, at least, dependent on China, on Chinese imports, on the Chinese market, on Chinese technology. And China could end the war if it wanted. It could simply exert so much pressure on Russia, sort of paralleling the Western pressure on Russia, that Russia would be forced to end the war. But the war is apparently in China's interest. So China is calculating that this is a good war. Now I think the situation has changed a little bit because the Americans are not any longer as interested in this war. So they have now the Trump administration has changed its priorities. Obviously, maybe China will now also take a different position, I would hope, at least, concerning this war, and perhaps be more active in resolving the conflict. But so far, in the last 3 years, China has been indirectly promoting this war. I mean, rhetorically, they are, of course, for peace and so on, and all sides should be considered. But de facto, the material support for Russia that China has given has driven the war to a large extent. Maybe that will change now. There may be even some very sort of devious motivation behind it, that China actually wants this war not only to continue because it sort of weakens the West, but also because some Chinese experts and politicians might calculate that it will weaken Russia, and maybe a weaker Russia is in China's interest. You know, we know that China has also territorial issues in Manchuria, and so there may be a long-term calculation also behind it, that this is basically a very useful war for China, because it weakens both of China's competitors, the West and Russia.
Weak Russia is in Ukrainian interest too. So I hope this conversation was useful for our viewers. Thank you, Andreas. And
thanks very much, Sophia.
To everyone who was with us until the end. Please like and share this video, and see you.